Hello there, and welcome. I'm so glad you found your way here tonight. Perhaps you've been thinking about mysteries, about strange arrivals and unexplained visitors. Or maybe you simply enjoy drifting to sleep with stories that blur the line between history and wonder. Whatever brought you here, you're in the right place. Tonight, we're traveling back to medieval England, to a small village called Woolpit, where one summer day in the 12th century, two children appeared from nowhere, and they were green. Not sick green or painted green, but naturally, impossibly green, as if their very skin had absorbed the color of leaves and grass. So let your breathing slow, your body sink into comfort, and your thoughts drift like dandelion seeds on a gentle breeze. This journey will be calm and curious, filled with the soft sounds of medieval village life and the quiet mystery of strangers who came from somewhere no one could name. And if these stories bring you peace, consider subscribing, leaving a like, and sharing which city you're listening from in the comments. It helps others find these gentle tales, one sleepy soul at a time. Now, let's begin. In the English county of Suffolk, nestled among rolling fields and ancient forests, there's a village called Woolpit. The name comes from the Old English words wolf and pit, meaning wolf pit, a deep trench once dug to trap wolves that roamed the woods. By the 12th century, the wolves were long gone, but the name remained, a memory of wilder times. The village was small, perhaps 100 souls, living in timber-framed houses with thatched roofs. Smoke curled from cooking fires. Children played in muddy lanes. Chickens scratched in dooryard gardens. The church bell marked the hours, calling people to prayer, to work, to rest. They farmed barley and wheat, tended sheep, and gathered at the church on Sundays to pray. Life moved slowly, marked by seasons rather than hours, by harvests and holy days, by birth and death, and the quiet rhythms of rural existence. It was a world of stone and wood, of candle smoke and wool, of muddy lanes and wildflower meadows. A world where most people never traveled more than a few miles from where they were born. A world where the forest was still deep and dark, where old beliefs lingered beneath Christian prayers, where strange things could still happen. The 12th century was a time of transition in England. The Norman conquest had happened less than 100 years before. French was the language of the court, Latin the language of the church, and English the language of common folk. Stone castles dotted the landscape, built by Norman lords to control the Saxon population. Monasteries preserved learning, copying manuscripts by candlelight. Most people couldn't read or write. Stories and knowledge passed orally, from generation to generation, shaped and reshaped by each telling. It was also a time when the boundary between the known and unknown was thinner than we might imagine today. People believed in things we've forgotten. They knew that forests held secrets, that the earth had hidden places, that sometimes the veil between worlds grew thin. Saints performed miracles. Demons tempted the faithful. Angels appeared in dreams. And sometimes the other folk, the fairies, the inhabitants of the hidden realm, crossed into the human world. One day, during the harvest season, when the fields were golden and the air smelled of cut grain, the village reapers were working near the edge of the forest. It was late August, perhaps, when the days were still long, but beginning to shorten. When the light took on that particular golden quality that comes just before autumn. The reapers moved through the wheat with their scythes, the blades flashing in the sunlight, the stalks falling in neat rows. It was hot work, tiring but necessary. The harvest had to be brought in before the weather turned. Every able-bodied person in the village would have been in the fields, men swinging scythes, women binding sheaves, children gathering loose stalks. Then, someone noticed movement near the old wolf pits. Two small figures stumbling through the tall grass at the forest's edge. At first, the workers thought they were village children playing where they shouldn't be. But as the figures came closer, the rhythmic swish of the scythes slowed, then stopped. Whispers spread through the field like ripples across water, because these were not ordinary children. They were green, a boy and a girl, perhaps 8 and 10 years old, dressed in strange clothes made of unfamiliar fabric. Not wool, not linen, but something smooth and oddly colored, in shades that didn't quite match anything the villagers knew. The fabric was woven in patterns that seemed foreign, cut in styles that looked wrong, as if tailored for a different kind of body, or a different understanding of how clothes should fit. But more striking than their clothing was their skin. It was green. Not the pale green of illness, not paint or dye that might rub off, but a deep, natural green, like the color of new leaves in spring, like moss on old stones, like the heart of the forest itself. Their hair was green too, though a lighter shade, like young willow branches. Their eyes were dark, perhaps brown or green. It was hard to tell. They looked human in every way except for this one impossible thing, their color. The children were frightened. They held each other's hands tightly and stared at the reapers with wide eyes. They spoke to each other in a language no one recognized, soft and lilting, full of sounds that didn't belong to English or Latin or French, or any tongue the villagers had ever heard. The sounds were almost musical, with a rhythm and cadence unlike anything familiar. Some who heard them said later that it sounded like wind through leaves or water over stones, something natural rather than human. The reapers didn't know what to do. Were these children human? Fairies? Demons? In the 12th century, the line between the natural and supernatural was uncertain. The church taught that demons could take any form, that the devil was always looking for souls to claim. But folk wisdom also held that fairy children sometimes wandered into the human world, that the boundaries between realms were porous, especially in certain places and at certain times. The forest behind the children was old, very old. It had been there long before the village, long before the Normans, long before even the Saxons came to England. In such ancient woods, people knew, strange things could happen. Clearings opened that hadn't been there before. Lights flickered between the trees at dusk. Travelers lost their way and emerged days later, confused and unable to explain where they'd been. But whatever these children were, they were clearly lost and afraid. They trembled. The girl's face was streaked with what might have been tears, though in the bright sunlight, with their green skin, it was hard to tell. The boy looked younger, more frightened, clinging to his sister's hand, as if she were the only solid thing in a world gone strange. So the villagers did what good people do. They put down their tools, approached slowly and gently, made soothing sounds the way you might with frightened animals. They didn't touch the children at first, just surrounded them at a distance, creating a human circle of protection. And slowly, carefully, they began to guide the children away from the forest edge, down the path toward the village. The children were taken to the home of Sir Richard de Calne, a local landowner and knight. His manor house was the largest building in the village, apart from the church, a stone structure with a great hall, private chambers, and outbuildings for servants and storage. Sir Richard was likely away, perhaps at court or fighting in one of the endless conflicts of the period. But his household ran smoothly in his absence, managed by his wife, whose name history hasn't preserved, but whose kindness the story remembers. She was a practical woman, motherly by nature despite being noble by birth. She looked at the green children with wonder, yes, but also with compassion. Whatever they were thin, exhausted, clearly in need of care. She ordered the servants to prepare a room for them, to bring water for washing, to heat food in the kitchen. She spoke to them gently, even though they couldn't understand her words. Her tone was soothing, maternal, the kind of voice that transcends language. She brought them bread, fresh and warm from the oven, its crust golden and crackling. The smell filled the room, yeasty and comforting. She offered them cheese, good yellow cheese made from the manor's own dairy. She poured them milk, still warm and frothy from the morning milking. She brought them roasted meat left over from the previous night's meal, tender and seasoned with herbs from the garden. But the children refused everything. They shook their heads, pressing themselves against the wall, their green faces showing clear distress. They seemed not just uninterested, but actively repelled by the food, as if it were poisonous or forbidden. They spoke to each other in their musical language, the girl apparently trying to explain something to the boy beginning to cry. Days passed. The household tried everything. They brought different kinds of bread. White bread made from fine wheat flour, coarse brown bread made from rye, sweet bread with honey. They offered fruit, apples from the orchard, pears, berries. They tried vegetables, turnips, onions, cabbages. They even brought fish from the nearby river, thinking perhaps the children came from a place that didn't eat land animals. Nothing worked. The children grew weaker. Their green skin, already pale compared to the rich green of fresh leaves, became paler still, almost translucent. Their eyes grew hollow. They barely moved, sitting together in a corner of the room, holding hands, speaking less and less. The household began to fear they would starve. Lady de Calne grew distressed. She had taken responsibility for these strange visitors, and she couldn't bear to watch them die. Then, one day, someone brought in fresh-cut beans from the garden. They were broad beans, still in their pods, freshly picked. The servant had been snapping them in the kitchen, preparing them for cooking, when she passed through the hall where the children sat. The green pods caught their attention immediately. Their heads turned. Their eyes widened. They rose to their feet and moved toward the beans with sudden energy, the first real interest they'd shown in anything since arriving. They grabbed the beans eagerly, almost desperately. But they didn't know how to open them. They tried to split the stalks, tearing at the fibrous stems that had held the pods to the plant. They pulled at the strings that ran along the pod seams, but in the wrong way, from the wrong angle. They were clearly familiar with beans, but didn't understand these particular beans, or perhaps the way they were harvested and prepared was different in their world. Gently, with patience, and without words, the servant showed them how to pinch the top of the pod between thumb and forefinger, how to pull the string that runs along the seam, how to split the pod open and reveal the beans inside, pale green and tender. The children watched intently, then imitated the motion. When they got it right and the pod opened, revealing the beans, their faces lit up with something like joy or relief or recognition. They ate eagerly, hungrily, as if they hadn't eaten in days, which perhaps they hadn't. They ate the beans raw, straight from the pod, not waiting for them to be cooked. They ate with their fingers, stuffing the beans into their mouths, chewing quickly, reaching for more. The servants brought more pods, as many as they could find. The children ate until they couldn't eat anymore, then curled up together and slept, really slept, peacefully for the first time since their arrival. For weeks, the green children would eat nothing but beans, raw beans, cooked beans, beans in any form. The household planted more, desperate to keep them fed. Servants scoured neighboring gardens, trading for beans, explaining that the strange green visitors would eat nothing else. Slowly, very slowly, the children began to accept other foods. First other legumes, peas, lentils, then certain vegetables, young lettuce leaves, fresh spinach, things that were green, then bread, if it was very soft and mixed with bean paste, then fruits, and finally, after many weeks, small amounts of meat and cheese. And as they ate, as their diet expanded, something remarkable began to happen. The green color started to fade. At first, it was barely noticeable, a slight lightening of the skin on their hands and faces, the parts most exposed to sunlight. Then it spread. Over months, the green slowly drained away like water from cloth, replaced by normal human skin tones. Not the dark tan of field workers or the pale complexion of nobles who stayed indoors, but something in between, a light olive tone that suggested southern or eastern origins, though still European, still recognizably human. The girl adapted more quickly than the boy. She learned a few words of English first. Bread, water, sleep, thank you. She began to smile, cautiously at first, then more freely. She watched the manor children play and eventually joined them, chasing chickens in the yard, playing simple games with stones and sticks. Her laughter, when it came, was like any child's laughter, bright and unguarded. But the boy remained withdrawn, sad. He sat by windows and stared at the sky, as if looking for something he couldn't find. He ate reluctantly, only enough to survive. He grew weaker despite the household's best efforts. He developed a cough that wouldn't go away. Within a year of their arrival, he died. The cause was unclear. Perhaps illness, perhaps heartbreak, perhaps homesickness for a place he could never return to. Perhaps he simply couldn't adapt, couldn't bear the brightness and strangeness of this world, couldn't find a way to live in a place where the sun blazed yellow and hot instead of the gentle twilight he remembered. They buried him in the churchyard at St. Mary's with Christian rites, because by then he had been baptized. The priest said prayers in Latin. The villagers stood around the grave, heads bowed, and the girl cried, green tears from eyes that were beginning to lose their color, mourning the loss of the last connection to her home world, the only person who spoke her language, who remembered what she remembered. The girl survived, and as she learned to speak English more fluently, as the months and years passed, she began to tell her story. Haltingly at first, with many misunderstandings and gaps, but gradually with more detail and clarity. She said she and her brother came from a place called St. Martin's Land. When asked where it was, she couldn't say in terms the villagers understood. Not north or south, not across the sea, not in any direction that made sense. It was, she tried to explain, not a place you could reach by walking or sailing. It was somewhere else, somewhere alongside the world, perhaps, or beneath it, or in another layer of existence, entirely. St. Martin's Land, she said, was a land where the sun never shone. But it wasn't dark. Instead, there was a perpetual twilight, a soft green glow that illuminated everything. The light came from everywhere and nowhere, gentle and constant, never bright enough to hurt the eyes, never dim enough to make seeing difficult. In this twilight, everything took on a greenish cast. The people there were all green, like her and her brother, not just their skin, but their clothes, their buildings, even their animals. They tended flocks of green sheep, whose wool was green, whose milk was slightly green, whose meat when eaten was pale green. They grew green crops, beans, of course, but also grains that looked like wheat, but grew in green stalks and produced green seeds. They had green trees that bore green fruit. The sky, if it could be called a sky, was a deeper green, like looking up through water toward a distant surface. There were no stars, no moon, no sun, just the endless, peaceful green twilight. The people of St. Martin's Land lived simply. They were farmers and shepherds, much like the people of Woolpit, but in a quieter, slower way. Time moved differently there, she thought, though she couldn't quite explain how. Days might have been longer or shorter, or perhaps there were no days at all, just continuous time unmarked by sunrise and sunset. Seasons changed, but subtly, more in feeling than in visible signs. One day, she and her brother were tending their father's sheep in a meadow near their village. It was peaceful work, kind children could do safely. The sheep grazed, tearing at green grass with green teeth. The children sat on a green hillside and talked, or sang, or simply watched the sheep as shepherds have done since time began. Then they heard a sound, bells perhaps, or something like bells but sweeter, more complex, a ringing that seemed to come from everywhere at once, carrying a melody that was almost familiar, but not quite. It was beautiful, irresistibly beautiful. The kind of sound that makes you want to follow it, to find its source, to discover what could make such music. They left the sheep. In any other circumstance, this would have been unthinkable, a serious breach of duty. But the sound called to them, pulled them, and they couldn't resist. They walked across the meadow, into a grove of green trees, following the sound that seemed always just ahead, always around the next corner. Then they found it, an opening in a hillside, a cave or tunnel mouth they'd never noticed before. The sound came from inside, echoing off stone walls, growing louder as they approached. The children looked at each other. They should have gone back. They should have run home, told their parents. Let adults make decisions. but they were children, and the sound was so beautiful. And curiosity is a powerful thing. They entered the tunnel. It was dark inside, much darker than anything in their world usually was. The green twilight from outside penetrated only a few steps inward, but the sound continued, drawing them forward. They walked slowly, hands outstretched, feeling their way along rough stone walls. The girl held her brother's hand. They walked for what seemed like a long time, though time was already becoming strange, stretching and compressing in ways they didn't understand. Then, gradually, they began to see light ahead. Not the familiar green glow of their world, but something different, something harsh and white and painfully bright. The sound had stopped, or perhaps they'd stopped noticing it. So focused were they on the light. They emerged into blinding brilliance. The sun, which they'd never seen before, blazed overhead in a blue sky they didn't understand. Everything was too colorful, too vivid, too sharp-edged and defined. The grass was the wrong color green, too yellow, too bright. The sky was impossible blue, and everything hurt to look at. The way looking at a flame hurts. They stumbled forward, confused and frightened, squinting against the painful light. They tried to find their way back to the tunnel, but when they turned around, they couldn't see an entrance. There was just a hillside, covered in grass and wildflowers, with no cave, no opening, no way back. They wandered, increasingly panicked. The sun moved across the sky, which frightened them more, because in their world, nothing moved like that. Eventually, exhausted and terrified, they collapsed near the old wolf pits. And that's where the reapers found them. That was her story, a story of a twilight land, of green people and green sheep, of a journey through darkness into blinding light, a story that raises more questions than it answers. The medieval chroniclers who recorded this story, men like William of Newburgh and Ralph of Coggeshall, treated it seriously. William of Newburgh, writing around 1200 in his Historia Rerum Anglicarum, prefaced the account by admitting it was extraordinary. I am somewhat hesitant to relate a tale so strange, and yet I cannot refrain, since I have learned it from men of such trust. He interviewed people who claimed to have witnessed the events or known the girl personally. Ralph of Coggeshall, abbot of a monastery just a few miles from Woolpit, wrote his account in his Chronicon Anglicanum around the same time. He claimed he had met people who knew the girl after she'd grown up, who had seen her when she was still slightly green. These were educated men, trained in rhetoric and logic, skeptical by nature. Yet they believed, or at least considered it possible, that something extraordinary had happened at Woolpit. So what really happened? Over the centuries, people have proposed many theories. Some are mundane, some are fantastical, and some fall somewhere in between. One explanation suggests the children were Flemish immigrants. In the 12th century, many Flemish people came to England, fleeing religious persecution or seeking economic opportunity. Some settled in East Anglia, not far from Woolpit. There was tension between Flemish immigrants and English natives, sometimes erupting into violence. Perhaps these children were Flemish, orphaned during a conflict, speaking Flemish which the English villagers wouldn't have recognized. Perhaps they'd been living rough in the forest, eating only what they could forage, and malnutrition gave their skin a greenish tint, But this theory has problems. The children's clothes were described as unfamiliar, not just foreign. And if they were Flemish, why would the girl's story reference St. Martin's Land rather than Flanders? Why would she describe a twilight world rather than a normal European country? Another theory proposes arsenic poisoning. Certain arsenic compounds can give skin a greenish tint. In medieval times, arsenic occurred naturally in some water sources and was used in various dyes and medicines. Perhaps the children had been exposed to arsenic over a long period through contaminated water in a mining region or through contact with arsenic-based materials. But chronic arsenic poisoning causes many other symptoms beyond skin discoloration, and it's usually fatal. The children survived, and their color faded, which doesn't fit the pattern of severe poisoning. A more intriguing theory suggests the children suffered from chlorosis, also called green sickness, a form of anemia that was once common, particularly in young girls. Chlorosis could give the skin a pale greenish hue, especially in poor lighting. It was caused by severe iron deficiency, often the result of malnutrition or a very restricted diet. The beans the children initially ate are very high in iron. If they had been surviving on a poor diet in their original location, eating mostly beans might have corrected the deficiency, gradually returning their skin to normal color. This theory is medically plausible. It explains the green skin and its gradual fading. But it doesn't explain the strange clothes, the unfamiliar language, or the detailed account of St. Martin's Land. Unless, of course, those details were embellishments added by medieval chroniclers who couldn't resist making the story more mysterious. Some researchers have suggested a geographical explanation. About 10 miles from Woolpit is a village called Fornham St. Martin. Notice the name, St. Martin. Perhaps this was the children's St. Martin's Land. Between Fornham and Woolpit lies the River Lark, and once lay much denser forest than exists today. Perhaps the children came from Fornham, became lost in the forest, wandered through old mine workings or natural cave systems, and emerged at Woolpit. The perpetual twilight they described might have been life in a forest so dense that full sunlight rarely reached the ground. Their green skin might have been due to living in near darkness combined with malnutrition. When they emerged into open farmland at Woolpit, the full sun would have been blinding and disorienting. This theory has the advantage of being entirely naturalistic, requiring no supernatural elements. But it feels incomplete. It explains the where, but not the emotional intensity of the story. Not why it was remembered for centuries. Not why medieval chroniclers found it remarkable enough to record. Then there are the folklore explanations. In Celtic and English tradition, green is the color of the fairies, the other folk, the inhabitants of the hidden world that exists alongside our own. Fairy hills, fairy rings, places where the veil between worlds is thin, all are associated with the color green. Green is the color of the wild, the untamed, the places beyond human control. In countless fairy tales, humans who wander into fairy mounds or rings find themselves in a twilight realm where time moves differently. What feels like an hour there might be years in the human world. Food from fairyland is dangerous. Eating it can trap you there forever. Similarly, fairy food brought into the human world is said to seem unpalatable to mortals. who find ordinary food appealing only after they've lost their connection to the other realm. The children's initial refusal of ordinary food, their acceptance only of beans, which are traditionally associated with the dead and with otherworldly realms. Their gradual adaptation and loss of color, all fit patterns found in fairy lore across Europe. And their story of St. Martin's Land sounds very much like descriptions of Tir na Nog, Avalon, or any of the many names given to the fairy realm in Celtic tradition. But folklore explanations, while poetic, don't satisfy everyone. They leave us in the realm of myth, beautiful but unverifiable. And the question remains, if these were fairy children, why couldn't they return? In most tales, the way back exists, if one knows how to find it. Modern researchers have proposed even more speculative theories. Some suggest the children might have been from a hidden underground community, people who lived in extensive cave systems and had adapted to low light over generations, developing light-sensitive skin with green pigmentation. When the children accidentally found an exit to the surface world, they couldn't find their way back into the labyrinth. Others have proposed parallel dimensions or alternate realities. In this interpretation, St. Martin's Land exists in the same physical space as England, but on a different dimensional plane. The tunnel the children walked through was a temporary rupture between realities. Such ruptures might be rare and unstable, opening briefly and then closing, leaving the children stranded in our world. There are even theories involving extraterrestrials, suggesting the children were from another planet, transported to Earth by accident. Their green skin, unfamiliar language, and description of a world with different light could support this. Perhaps St. Martin's Land was a generation ship, traveling through space in artificial twilight, and the children somehow ended up on Earth through a transporter malfunction or escape pod accident. These theories, while creative, require accepting ideas that can't be proven and that stretch the boundaries of what we consider possible. They keep the mystery alive, keep people thinking and wondering. The truth is, we don't know. We may never know. The events, if they happened at all, occurred over 800 years ago. The witnesses are long dead. Any physical evidence is gone. The girl herself, if she ever existed, died centuries ago, her memories gone with her. What remains is a story, strange and beautiful and impossible to fully explain. And perhaps that's enough. Perhaps the not knowing is the point. What we do know, or what the records suggest, is that the girl eventually adapted completely to life in Woolpit. Her green color faded entirely. She learned English fluently, lost all trace of whatever language she'd spoken before. She was baptized in the village church, given the Christian name Agnes, or possibly Martha. Sources differ. She was integrated into the community, no longer seen as strange or foreign. Some accounts say she eventually married, possibly to a man from the nearby town of King's Lynn. One chronicle mentions she became rather loose and wanton in her conduct, which might mean she was more free-spirited than medieval society approved, or might simply be medieval moralizing about a woman who didn't fit conventional patterns. She may have had children, lived a long life, died old and respected, her early strangeness forgotten or transformed into just another story about the old days. But she never forgot where she came from. Those who knew her said she would sometimes grow quiet and stare at the horizon, particularly at twilight, when the light softened and took on that greenish quality just before sunset. Perhaps in those moments she remembered another twilight, one that never ended, a green and gentle world where she had once been home, and the village never forgot her. The story was passed down, generation after generation, becoming part of Woolpit's identity. In medieval times, having a mystery, a miracle, a strange event in your village was valuable. It brought prestige, attracted pilgrims, marked you as a place where something extraordinary had happened. Woolpit's green children became a point of pride, a story to tell travelers, a way of saying, strange things happen here, in this ordinary-seeming village by the forest. Let's pause for a moment and think about what this story means, because beneath the mystery of green skin and twilight lands, there's something deeper, something that resonates across time. This is fundamentally a story about strangers, about people who arrive from elsewhere, looking different, speaking differently, behaving differently, about being so foreign that you don't even seem human at first. And it's a story about how a community responds to those strangers. The people of Woolpit could have driven the children away. They could have feared them, harmed them, treated them as demons or threats. In a time when superstition was strong and difference was often punished, that would have been understandable, even expected. When people didn't understand something, they often responded with violence. Witch burnings, persecution of Jews, violence against lepers and the mentally ill, all were common in medieval Europe. But the people of Woolpit chose differently. They welcomed the children, fed them, sheltered them, tried to understand them. They showed patience when the children refused ordinary food, when they couldn't communicate, when their needs weren't clear. They showed kindness when the children were frightened and confused. They gave them time to adapt, space to grieve when the boy died, and acceptance despite their continuing strangeness. This is the heart of the story's power. It's a tale about compassion across difference, about seeing the humanity in the other, about choosing welcome over fear. It suggests that our first instinct toward strangers can be generosity rather than suspicion, that communities can expand to include those who seem impossibly foreign. The green children were as foreign as anyone could be, not just from another village or country, but possibly from another world entirely. Yet they were taken in. One died, mourned, and buried with respect. The other lived, adapted, and eventually became part of the community. No longer green, no longer strange, but still carrying within her the memory of elsewhere. There's also something profoundly poignant about the children's journey. They left a place they called home, crossed a threshold they couldn't recross, and found themselves in a world that was too bright, too harsh, too different. They lost their color, their language, their connection to everything familiar. The boy couldn't bear it and died. The girl survived, but at tremendous cost. She had to become someone new, had to let go of almost everything she'd been. This is the immigrant's experience, the refugee's experience, the experience of anyone who has been displaced and forced to rebuild in unfamiliar territory. The story speaks to that loss, that transformation, that slow and painful process of becoming something other than what you were. It speaks to the grief of leaving home, even when that leaving wasn't voluntary, even when there's no way back. But it also speaks to resilience. The girl survived. She adapted. She learned. She found a way to live in this new world without entirely forgetting the old one. She held both within her, the green twilight of St. Martin's Land and the bright sunshine of Woolpit, two worlds existing in one person. And perhaps that's what the story is really about. The universal experience of living between worlds, of carrying within yourself more than one place, more than one identity, more than one way of being. In the village of Woolpit today, there's a sign commemorating the green children. It stands near the church, a wooden marker with two carved figures painted green, standing hand in hand. Tourists come to see it, to take pictures, to wonder about the old story. The pub is called the Green Children. The village embraces its mystery, recognizes it as part of its heritage. The church itself, St. Mary's, dates back to the 12th century, though it has been rebuilt and restored many times. It's a beautiful building, as many English country churches are, with a square tower, stained glass windows, and walls that have stood for nearly 1,000 years. It's possible, even likely, that the Green Children were baptized in this church, that their names were recorded in parish registers now lost, that they heard Latin prayers echoing off these same stone walls. Inside the church, carved into the woodwork, are images of green men, faces made of leaves, mouths sprouting foliage. These are common in English churches, pre-Christian symbols adopted and absorbed by Christianity, representing nature, fertility, the wild places beyond human control. They're green, like the children. Perhaps not coincidentally. The village is quiet now, much as it must have been 800 years ago. Fields still surround it, though they're farmed with tractors now instead of oxen. The sky is still wide. Sheep still graze in green pastures. The forest is smaller, pushed back by centuries of farming, but still present on the horizon. And if you walk out to where the old wolf pits once were, though no one knows exactly where that was anymore, you can imagine two small figures stumbling out of the trees, green and afraid, and impossibly far from home. The story of the Green Children has inspired countless retellings. It appears in Kevin Crossley Holland's children's books, in plays and operas, in academic papers, and speculative fiction. The British composer Nicola Lefanu wrote an opera about them. Artists have painted them, green and luminous, standing at the threshold between forest and field, between known and unknown. Writers have imagined their lives, their thoughts, their feelings, expanding the brief historical accounts into full narratives. Each retelling adds something new while keeping the essential mystery intact, because the story invites interpretation, encourages imagination, rewards those who engage with it creatively. It's a story with space in it, room for the reader or listener to wonder, to fill in gaps, to imagine possibilities. And in that sense, the Green Children continue to cross thresholds, not from one world to another, but from past to present, from history to imagination, from the medieval chronicles that first recorded them to the minds of everyone who hears their story and wonders, what if? What if there are other worlds just beyond our perception? What if the boundaries between them are thinner than we think? What if sometimes, by accident or grace, those boundaries open and allow passage? And what if the appropriate response to those who cross through is not fear, but welcome? So as you drift towards sleep tonight, let yourself imagine a twilight land where everything is green, where sheep graze in emerald fields and people live in soft, muted light, where the sun never rises or sets but gentle illumination continues endlessly, peaceful and constant, a place that might exist somewhere, somewhen, somehow, just beyond the edge of what we know. And imagine two children, green as new leaves, stepping through a dark tunnel into blinding brightness, into a world so different from their own, it must have felt like a dream or a nightmare. Imagine their fear, their confusion, their slow adaptation to strangeness, the way the world must have hurt their eyes at first, the way ordinary food must have tasted wrong, the way every sound, every smell, every sensation was unfamiliar. And imagine, finally, a village that welcomed them, that didn't turn them away, didn't harm them, didn't treat them as monsters, that fed them beans when they couldn't eat bread, that waited patiently for them to learn a new language, a new way of being, that buried the boy with dignity when he died, and embraced the girl as she slowly, painfully became one of them. This is the story's gift to us. Not answers, but images. Not explanations, but feelings. The sense that somewhere in the past, or perhaps even now, in the space between worlds, something strange and beautiful happened. And that the response to that strangeness was not fear, but kindness. That's a story worth remembering. That's a story worth carrying with us into sleep and dreams, because it reminds us what we might be capable of at our best. To welcome the stranger, to show patience with the bewildered, to offer home to those who have none. If you're still awake, you're welcome to continue to another story. But if sleep is calling, let yourself go now. Close your eyes and drift into that soft green twilight where everything is gentle and quiet and strange. Dream of threshold moments, of crossing from one world into another. Dream of being welcomed despite your difference, of finding home in unexpected places. Dream of a color that doesn't quite exist anymore, of children who came from nowhere and changed a village forever. Sleep well, dear traveler, and remember to subscribe, like this video, and share your city in the comments so we can continue these journeys together. One sleepy soul at a time. Good night,